Welcome to Voices in the Wilderness, conversations about church and leader health. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org. My name is Marcus Carlson, and today our guest is Jonathan Haseley. Welcome, Jonathan.
Marcus, thanks for having me on again.
It's so good to have you on. And I want to remind everyone for the last couple podcasts and the next several podcasts, we're walking through the habits of healthy churches, taking one podcast episode for each of the 7 habits from the book. And so today you and I are going to talk about habit 4. Healthy churches focus more on those outside the church than those inside the church. Always one that kind of creates some conversation and reaction for sure.
Absolutely.
So you've done a lot of different things in the church, church planting, working in a large church, working in a smaller church, doing some revitalization type work. What have you learned in all of that experience about the importance of focusing on those outside the church?
Yeah. Yeah, you could say jack of all trades, master of none, all that sorts of fun stuff. It's surprisingly, even though they're different settings and different ministry needs, you can, no matter if it's a church plant, if it's a larger church or a small church revitalization, you can get often very focused on internal things, and you have to consciously push back against cocooning yourself off. So even with the church plant, where we were trying to branch out into the community, it's so easy to get tunnel vision and focus on things that are internal, trying to get the systems in place, trying to get personnel in place. With larger church, the temptation is to focus on programs and programs and more programs. And with revitalization, which I think you can justify a little bit, just trying to survive and get to the thriving stage and just making sure you can move ahead. But the cocooning off is something that can happen just all too easily. One of the other things that I've found as you're working through the habits with whether it's a church plant, larger church, revitalization for a smaller church, is the pastor cannot be the only one that's kind of waving the banner for this external focus on the outside. You have to have a leadership core that's engaged and buys into their vision, the vision of the church, not just the pastor's vision, or else it's never going to last. So those two things I would say starting off for that question.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are good words. I like the word cocooning. You know, one of the things that I say oftentimes when I'm talking about this habit is that the church is the only institution in the history of the world that exists primarily for those outside of it. I actually repeat it all the time, that the church is the only institution in the history of the world that exists primarily for those outside of it. And all of us that are in the church are in the church because of someone else, a parent, a grandparent, a pastor, a neighbor, boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever it might be. But even with that, even with sharing that, and even thinking about, gosh, we want this church and churches to be here for our grandchildren and great grandchildren. This is one of our most controversial habits with, some churchgoers. Why do you think, from your perspective, that this habit, kind of creates a little more reaction and controversy?
I go back to the Apostle Paul. So he's writing this letter to the Christians that are in Rome. And he goes through a lot of pretty substantial theology about the gospel, about God's grace, his initiative during the first part. And then it has this transition in Romans chapter 12. And he talks about being living sacrifices, and that's our act of worship. And I've always joked around, and I've used it before, saying, what's the problem with living sacrifices? They're always trying to crawl off the altar.
Mm.
It doesn't matter if it's a congregation member, a leader, a pastor. We are so consumed by consumerism and
Yes.
comfort that uh, being a living sacrifice is not exactly something that we want to sink our teeth into, like we actively want to do it by ourselves. I mean, the Holy Spirit needs to be at work in our lives, saying, "I'm laying my life down for the sake of others," and that's actually where I find my life. But that's so countercultural to the air that we breathe, the water that we swim in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good word. And what people say is, "What about me?" And I want to say, like, you're already here. Mature Christians set aside their preferences for less mature Christians, and we're actually really good, for the most part, at caring for one another in the church, right? But it is a lot of that kind of Burger King mindset, like have it your way, right away. And so from your perspective, what kind of encouragement would you offer churches, even as you lead a church, to
Mhm.
be more externally focused?
I think we need to stop thinking with the mindset of season ticket holders and more so as missionaries. We can often default into what our rights are as
Mm,
season ticket holders. Like we're so quick to jump on, well, these are my rights according to Constitution, bylaws, whatever. But we shy away from those missional responsibilities, which actually are missional privileges. So I
mm.
think how we talk about and even the verbiage we use is important. Um, I think the other thing is leadership has to model. If the congregation is actually going to see this and listen. So, like, one of the things that I do is I have intentionally made sure that I get a haircut every month. And the reason for that is because I have the best conversations with my barber, who is a early 20 something, kind of on the gray zone of what he believes. And I get to sit there and he asks questions and I have a captive audience, and it's a beautiful thing, not just talking about spiritual things, but how we're living in this cultural moment, the political craziness we're in, and how faith speaks into that. So I make sure that I have a haircut every single month, which I got a few days ago, to have that opportunity to speak to this younger person. And so that's only one of the things. But then I also tell people it's like, you got to have your eyes open to seek, to recognize, and to respond, like our friend Greg Finke talks about, to what God's up to in the spontaneous, in the everyday. So I think it's important that leadership models that. Um, and then the other thing I'd say is keeping the main thing. Like we gather together to receive from God, from His Word, to have encouragement, to have community time, and then we scatter so that we're able to actually play the game, not stay in the huddle, but to play the game the rest of the week. And it's this rhythm of gathering and scattering that really is the lifeblood of the living organism that's the Church of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I love that imagery. And, one of the things I remind people, these days we see worship, whether on Wednesday or Saturday or Sunday is kind of the main event. But, historically, worship was the in between, that you came to worship to celebrate all the ministry you did in the world during the week and to be rejuvenated and strengthened for all the ministry that you would do in the next week. And so, I think, Reggie Joyner, not Reggie Joyner, Reggie McNeil talks about, the idea of the church as an airport, right? That if the airport is full, it's not doing its job. It's like sending, 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 sending. And I don't think that we often look at that. And, one of the things that's also interesting to me is, uh, I tell churches, maybe like two-thirds to three-quarters of your resources and energy and ministry should be focused on those outside the church, where a quarter to a third should be focused on those inside the church. It's not that we don't, emphasize that at all, but again, we're already here, and so kind of our call, our drive, is to go, and it is. You're right. It is the consumerism, that really impacts us. That we want to be fed. That we want to get what we get and kind of go. I mean, what would you say to kind of challenge some folks that struggle with that consumerism piece? Any advice or input for those of us that have that challenge sometimes?
Yeah, it's so easy as a leader to say, well, it's the people that don't get it, when we struggle with the same things as leaders.
For sure.
And so we're all in this together in saying, it's taking Jesus at his words when he says, if you try to hang on to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and the gospel's sake, you're actually going to find your life. And so I think it really comes down to is, do we actually take Jesus at his word and trust him? Do we trust his word, what he's saying to us, even though it seems, like we said before, so countercultural? And I think it's that whole thing of leaning into Jesus's words, but then also being an active listener. So, also something is, um, are we listening to our mission field in our community? So instead of presuming what the needs are, or presuming what the desires or wants are we actually actively listening to the mission field, saying what they need and what they want, and what's a bridge that will actually then allow us to speak Jesus and his beautiful gospel into their lives?
Yeah, I think all of that is super helpful, right? And it's that I do think you're right. We're modeling the culture. It's a very consumeristic culture, and we have lots of options. But the Great Commission was never about us. It was about everybody else. I mean, that's every church has its own individual identity and purpose and mission. But the core mission of any church, of course, is to make disciples, and that going, not just out, but in your kind of daily coming and going, I think is certainly a huge deal. And just to recognize it's not about us. It's not about me. And that really, what organization, what institution, what system could expect to continue to exist and continue to grow never if it only reaches the people who are already there, right? Like, if you're starting a new small business and the only customers you focus on are the ones that you have, and church people aren't customers, it's not consumerism. But if you only focus on the people you have, eventually you're not going to have those people, and you're not going to have everything. So, like, from a theological perspective, from a biblical perspective, from a practical perspective, this makes sense. But I think we do get stuck. And one of my friends often likes to ask people in churches, what are you willing to sacrifice so that this church is here for your grandchildren and great grandchildren and great great grandchildren? And I think that we're kind of selective in the church with self denial and self sacrifice, and it's our selection, not Jesus's selection. We're not denying and sacrificing the things that Jesus tells us to do. We're denying and sacrificing the things that we have decided we're willing to sacrifice.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. You said it's not about us. I've actually, on a couple of occasions, used strategic preaching, or we were having a meeting because we're in the middle of a rebuilding project, and I had the congregation say, like, repeat after me, it's not about us, so that we actually verbalized it together. And so that's another component, Marcus, that I think is important, the modeling, but then using the strategic preaching, the strategic Bible studies, the strategic just conversations to speak to those people as a congregation as a whole, but also to speak to those key individuals that hold that sway, whether they're formal or informal leaders in the church, is saying, like, this is a big deal, this habit of focusing externally. And of course, it's going to be uncomfortable for each of us in all of our very different ways. But this is at the heart of the gospel, self-giving, sacrificial love, that's the heart of Jesus.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. And again, it certainly is about Jesus. And obviously, like I said, you've been in some settings where you're building a church, from nothing, and you're rebuilding a church from the ashes right now. And so it's easier for you to, in this moment, focus on that. And maybe even your folks see the decline and feel the decline, and so they can be focused on it. But in between those two churches, you served a church that maybe didn't have to focus on it because there was a critical mass and some regularity of visitors. What did you learn from that that's kind of helped you in this season?
Yeah, I think it's the idea of, it's not that attractional as opposed to missional, but it's what you do with those things. And I think both of them can work together. So it's not to say that we shouldn't have an inviting culture, that we should have good hospitality. It should be an atmosphere where if people come, they feel that it's warm, welcoming, people connect with them, but coupling that with saying, okay, it's great that we have that here, but we need to extend out there. And I think it's both the attractional and the missional that have to work together, um, but not just focusing on one to the exclusion of the other.
Yeah, and again, that's right. It's not, focus only on those outside the church. It's, focus primarily on those outside the church. And I
Hmm.
think we have to remember that. Again, this is an important piece, that this is who we are, is the Church of Jesus Christ. This is how we all ended up in the church. This is how the church continues to thrive and survive. That it really is the only institution in the history of the world that exists primarily for those outside of it. And so, what can we do to really care for, minister to, and serve people? Right, not the bait and switch. Not
Hmm.
oh, let's do this so they come in our building and they'll see our building and want to come to our church. That's never really worked. Or oh, we're gonna do this for you to serve you, but only to get you to come to our church. But to really just focus on ministering to people outside the church and trusting God with the results. That when you don't focus on that kind of attraction or recruiting or growing, you actually grow better than when you focus on that. And certainly the science and the data, and at least my own experience, has borne that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the cliche or the phrase, we're not in Kansas anymore, and we haven't been for a long time. I mean, we are not as pastors and ministry leaders, franchise managers of a place of religious goods and services. We are mission outposts in the mission field wilderness that strategically need to have mission deployment out into the frontier. And I think if you grapple with that type of shift in reality, um, it changes your whole outlook of doing ministry.
Yeah, the phrase I like to use is we're the American church is acting like Sears in an Amazon world, right?
Mm,
And that Sears used to be innovative. It used to be how I would do all my Christmas shopping in the Sears catalog, and
right.
now they don't exist because they thrived by focusing on a new way to reach new people, and then they didn't pivot. And I think, we assume that because God doesn't change, that the church shouldn't change or that we shouldn't change, but we do. And the Spirit continues to move. And yes, God doesn't change, but we do, and the world does. And even Jesus did ministry in context. He spoke to the people. He didn't do the y'all come thing, right? Like, even the closest example of that maybe is the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't even say y'all come. He said, I'm preaching here. But every other instance he was going to the people. And so why would we do it differently? The early church in Acts didn't have buildings. They didn't do the y'all come. And I think it's great to have buildings and great to have programs and ministries and these resources, but the method has become kind of the end all instead of a tool to do what we're called to do, which is, to reach Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth.
Yeah, the message doesn't change, but the means and the methods do. That message is the gospel that's timeless, speaks into every culture, every season, but the methods and the ways and the means that we deliver that, connect with people, make on ramps, create bridges, those things all need to be contextualized for where we're at.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. Jonathan, it's been great sharing, great hearing from you. Really appreciate you coming on today as we, talk about this habit that healthy churches focus more on those outside the church than those inside the church.
Well, Marcus, thank you once again for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions, including for podcast topics and guests. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org.